get it done before lunch. Okay, so here's what's going on with this. We've just finished doing a hypothesis test where you reject or you do not reject the null hypothesis. Okay, well, you hope that, you are supposed to get a sample that leads you to the correct conclusion, that leads you to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. You are hoping you get a sample that gives you the correct conclusion to the situation. Now, you never really know, because this is kind of like a thing that's out there, and you're just taking a sample and inferring about the population. So what happens is this. Sometimes you get a weird or a statistically unlikely sample. Sometimes you actually get a sample that is out there that was very unusual to have gotten. And it led you to draw a conclusion about the null hypothesis that should not have been drawn. Those types of incorrect conclusions that occur because you just happened to get an unusual sample are called type 1 and type 2 errors. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, I want to kind of actually talk about those definitions at the same time because they're very similar, so let's get them straight in our mind. So, with a type 1 error, the null hypothesis is true. So we're actually going to draw a picture of that as we go along and do this discussion. So with the type 1 error, you never really know this, but a type 1 error occurs when the null hypothesis is true. So all your data is in here, in this curve, okay? And so therefore, you're supposed to find evidence close to the null hypothesis. You are supposed to find a sample in here, or a sample here, or a sample in here. You are supposed to find a sample in there that would lead you to fail to reject, because the null hypothesis is true. But guess what happens? Oops. You randomly get a sample that was very unlikely to have been gotten. So you accidentally you got something out there. It happens part of the time. And if I say this is my alpha, then what's happening over here? What is this called? Anything that's in this section here will be what? Will make the null hypothesis get rejected. Okay, so anything in here, this is called the rejection region, where you would reject the null hypothesis. And so it is possible that even though this is unlikely to have been obtained, you got a sample in the rejection region and you rejected the null hypothesis even though you were not supposed to. That's your type 1 error. Okay? So in conclusion, a type 1 error, the null is true. But you rejected it. And you were not supposed to. So that's your summary of the type 1 error. The null is true, but you rejected it and you were not supposed to. So let's now compare that to the null hypothesis is false. Okay, so here's what it will look like if the null hypothesis is false. Here's your null hypothesis. It is false. Well, guess what? Since it is false, your data is not in here, because the null hypothesis is false. So your data is not in there. It's somewhere else. Where is it? It's wherever the alternative is. So let's say that we've got this here. This is the alternative, and this is true. So most of the data, the data is here. Okay, so this is where you should be getting all your samples. And all of these samples that I'm drawing right now are going to lead you to do what? All of these samples that I have drawn in here are going to cause you to do what to the null hypothesis? Reject it, which you should, because the null is false. But what happens, let me go ahead and draw that rejection region in there, though, by the way. Let me put your alpha in there. So here's alpha. So here's the rejection region. Okay? And there is plenty of things out here in the rejection region. Everything here, all of this data is essentially in the rejection. I mean, you got plenty of chances to reject that null hypothesis since it's false. But guess what? You might inadvertently, through no fault of your own, get a sample right there. Now, in terms of this green curve, in terms of your alternative, that was not likely to happen. It was not very likely for you to get a sample located right here. But it could technically happen. It was statistically unlikely, but it happened. And if something is right here, if a sample is located here on the inside of the alpha, what is your decision then? You failed to reject. You got this thing, it's close enough to the null, and with this sample here, you would fail to reject. Well, guess what? That's bad. You were supposed to have rejected it because it's false. So, in summary, for your null hypothesis, the null hypothesis is false, but you got a weird sample that you then failed to reject the null. Okay? It's false, but you failed to reject the null. That's type 2. Okay. So those consequences of those things affect different people. So let's actually look at this in context. So here we go. All right, so let's say that you are the shipment manager for, I don't know, pen, some type of pen, and you need a particular part, this little inside cartridge, to be 2 inches long so that it's going to fit correctly into your pen. Okay, so you are the shipment manager. A shipment of parts has arrived, and you've decided you are the person, you are the gatekeeper. You decide to either take the shipment or to not take the shipment. So, the manufacturing company that sends you those parts says that the specification for the parts show an average length of 2 inches. Okay? So the null is that the average length is 2 inches. But if you find that the shipment does not meet specifications, then the entire shipment is going to be sent back to the manufacturer. Okay? And then they will have to send you a new one. So if you find that the parts are not equal to 2 inches, then you're going to do that. So you're going to take a sample. Do you want to have to inspect all of those ink cartridges? No, you don't. That's way too much. So you're going to take a sample. And from that sample, you're going to make a conclusion about the entire shipment and decide to accept it or reject it. So, in context, let's talk about what kind of errors would be made. I always like to write the little shortcut definition before I then put it into context. So a type 1 error happens when the null is what? True, but you found a rare sample and you actually rejected it when you were not supposed to. Okay, so there's the little thing that I'm thinking in my head. So how does that apply to this shipment of these little ink cartridges that are supposed to be 2 inches long? Okay, so the shipment is acceptable. Okay, good. So let's do that. The parts are acceptable, but I got an unusual sample. It's an I. I got an unusual sample. That gave me evidence to reject the shipment. Remember, we're doing this in context. So I rejected the shipment. I sent it back to the manufacturer, and they were actually acceptable. What's the consequences for that error? Yeah. Who does that bad for? Who is like wholly not wanting that to happen? The manufacturer, the person that is sending you the shipment, does not want that to happen. So here's the consequence. The manufacturer that is making those parts loses money because OK parts are sent back and a new shipment has to be sent. That's your, now you have to figure that out. You work for the manufacturer and decide that. What's the probability, you could, maybe if you're the manufacturer, the shipment comes back to you and you're like, I don't really think there's a problem here. So you take a test and you get a good sample. You're like, they must have just gotten a weird sample. So I'm going to send it back to them and take the chances and hope that they're going to get a good sample this time. Okay? So whatever. That's up to you. That's okay. So let's do type 2 error. So my brain thinks this. I say, okay, the null is false, but I fail to reject it. Okay, so, all right, so now that's what my brain thinks. So now I got to put this into context. Okay, so this is false. So put it in context. The what? The shipment's not acceptable. Okay, so the shipment is not okay. So here we go. The shipment is not acceptable. But when I was taking a random sample, I got an unusual sample that what? Did not give me evidence to reject the shipment. Okay, so let's talk about the consequences of that error. So as a consequence, what happens with my pen company and these ink cartridges that are coming to me? What happens? Yeah, I have now paid for faulty parts. Okay, so the consequence is that my company has paid for faulty parts. All right. Of course, that affects my money. So now, what type of error would you, the shipment inspector for your company, really want to avoid? Yeah, type 2. And it says explain, but I think that's actually redundant. It's kind of taken care of right there. Okay, so what I want to do is give you 10 minutes to actually work on your homework, your little one-page thing. And then after that, so hold on a second, because I'm going to bridge into what we're going to do after 10 minutes. We're going to talk about controlling the likelihood of a type 1 error or a type 2 error. What can you do, to control what's happening? Okay? And so if you want to control what's happening, then you can set a particular alpha. Now, who do you think is going to set that alpha level? Probably the person who is paying for the test. Don't you think? Probably the person paying for the test. Okay. So that's how that's what we're going to head to after your 10 minutes right here of doing your stuff. So go ahead and do that. Start your 10 minutes, do your homework, and then we'll meet back and talk about that, controlling the alpha.